This autistic girl tried to help a millionaire sitting on the edge of a bridge, ready to jump, but before she could get away, he pulled her and, "Leave a comment and support my work by subscribing to my channel." The drizzling rain that night in Chicago mirrored the profound sadness consuming Richard. Seated alone in his empty office, he watched the city's movement through the blurred window, his gaze lost in painful memories. In his hands, he held the last picture he took with Sarah and Billy, his wife and son, before the accident that took them forever. The office's silence was broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the ticking of the clock on the wall, marking another pointless day in his empty existence. The walls, once adorned with diplomas and certificates of business success, now displayed only lighter rectangular marks, silent witnesses of a prosperous past fading away. His cell phone rang for the 10th time that day. It was Dave, his accountant, trying once again to warn him about the company's critical situation. Richard ignored the call, as he had been doing for the past few weeks. Ever since discovering his partner and best friend's betrayal, who had embezzled a huge sum of money from the company, he had withdrawn into a shell of bitterness and isolation. Horizon Builders, once his pride and joy, was now on the brink of collapse. The employees, whom he considered family, were beginning to abandon ship one by one, foreseeing the inevitable sinking. Debts piled up like an avalanche impossible to contain, and creditors multiplied day after day. Richard picked up the photo frame and ran his fingers over the glass, wiping away a thin layer of dust. In the image frozen in time, Sarah smiled, radiantly, her blue eyes sparkling with happiness as she held little Billy in her arms. The boy, only 5 years old, sported a gap-toothed grin and proudly held his favorite toy car, a gift Richard had brought back from a business trip. "If you were here," he murmured to himself, feeling tears begin to form, "if I hadn't insisted on driving that night." The guilt gnawed at him like an unrelenting acid. It had been his stubbornness to continue driving, even with sleepiness, and exhaustion after a long day of work that had caused the accident. A moment of distraction, a blink of an eye too long, and everything he loved was gone. He stood up abruptly, putting the photo frame back in the drawer. He couldn't stand being there any longer, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the problems of the present. He grabbed his coat and left the office without looking back, ignoring the various files on his desk that demanded urgent attention. The night was cold and damp, typical of a Chicago winter. Richard walked aimlessly through the downtown streets, letting his feet guide him as his mind wandered in a whirlwind of dark thoughts. He passed crowded bars, illuminated restaurants, and groups of people laughing and talking, oblivious to his pain. How could the world keep spinning when his had stopped completely? His steps led him to an old bridge over the Chicago River. He stopped in the middle of it, leaning on the concrete railing and watching the dark waters flowing silently. Below, loneliness enveloped him like a heavy cloak, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to cry truly. Tears flowed uncontrollably down his face, mingling with the drizzle that continued to fall. His body trembled with stifled sobs, years of pain and guilt finally overflowing. It was in this moment of utter vulnerability that he heard light footsteps approaching. Beside him, a small figure emerged like a ghost in the night. It was a girl, no older than 9, wearing a faded pink jacket and carrying a backpack. Her big eyes stared at him with a peculiar curiosity, showing no embarrassment at his tears. The girl came closer, invading his personal space in a way that made him uncomfortable. Richard tried to move away, but she followed him, always keeping the same distance. There was something different about her behavior, an absence of social filters that irritated him deeply in that moment of despair. "Go away," he said sharply, but the girl didn't move. Instead, she reached out as if to touch his tear-stained face. That's when Richard, without thinking, reacted abruptly. He grabbed her arm tightly, trying to push her away. Everything happened very quickly. The girl lost her balance and fell sitting on the wet bridge floor. Her eyes widened in shock, and in the next second, a sharp, desperate scream cut through the night. It wasn't the usual cry of an injured child. It was a primal, visceral sound, filled with pure panic. "Lily!" A male and furious voice thundered in the darkness. "Get away from my daughter!" A tall, lean man materialized from the shadows, striding heavily toward Richard. His eyes flashed with anger as he approached, his clenched fists betraying his contained fury. It was David, who had followed his daughter after she slipped out of his sight a few minutes before. "What do you think you're doing to my daughter?" David roared, positioning himself between Richard and Lily, who was still crying uncontrollably on the ground. The sound of the girl's crying was unlike anything Richard had ever heard, a deep, agonizing lament that seemed to come from another world. Richard remained still, his head down, feeling the weight of yet another guilt adding to the burden he already carried. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible beneath the sound of the rain and Lily's sobs. "I didn't mean to hurt her. She wouldn't stop getting closer." David crouched down to calm his daughter, but his gestures were different from what one would expect. He didn't touch her directly, but made gentle movements with his hands, as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Gradually, Lily's crying subsided, transforming into a rhythmic rocking of her body. "She's autistic," David explained, his voice still tense, but now carrying a note of weariness. "She doesn't understand personal boundaries like other children. When she sees someone crying—" He paused, running a hand over his wet face. "She tries to help in her own way." The heavy silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the rain and Lily's still irregular breathing. Richard looked at the girl, now calmer, but still rocking her body back and forth. Her face showed no fear or anger, just a distant expression, as if she were somewhere else. "I'm so sorry," Richard repeated, this time with more strength in his voice. "I'm not in a good place, but that's no excuse." He gave a step back, wanting to get away from that situation, from that mistake, from that night. But before he could turn around, Lily lifted her face and their eyes met. There was something in that look, a purity, a total absence of judgment that hit him like a punch in the gut. For the first time in a long time, Richard saw himself truly reflected in the eyes of another human being. There was no pity, no condemnation, just a genuine and innocent curiosity. "Daddy!" Lily's voice sounded clear and unexpectedly firm. "He's sad like Mummy was." The simplicity of the observation made David falter. His expression softened a little as he looked more closely at Richard, noticing for the first time the obvious signs of helplessness in the man before him. "Lily lost her mother 2 years ago," David said, his voice now softer. "Since then, she's developed this sensitivity to the pain of others. Sometimes I think she sees things that we can't." Richard felt his legs weaken. He leaned against the bridge railing, feeling the weight of the last hours, the last months, the last years collapse on his shoulders. "My wife and son," he began to say, but the words died in his throat. "Come on," David said, surprising himself. "There's a diner nearby. I think we all need to dry off and warm up a bit." He reached out to help Lily get up, but the girl was already standing, approaching Richard again. In the small and cozy diner, under the fluorescent light and between cups of steaming coffee, Richard found himself telling his story. He spoke about the accident, about the guilt he carried, about the company that was sinking. The words came out like a dammed river that finally finds a breach in the dam. David listened in silence, occasionally nodding his head. Lily, sitting next to her father, drew geometric patterns on a napkin, seemingly oblivious to the conversation. But every now and then she looked up to observe Richard with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see his soul. "Life has its ways," David said finally after Richard finished his account. "Sometimes it hits us so hard that we think we're not going to get up. After Clara, my wife, was gone, well, I didn't think I could go on. But Lily," he looked at his daughter with affection, "she taught me that there's always a reason to keep going." The night wore on, and the rain outside finally began to subside. When they said goodbye, Richard felt something different in his chest. Not exactly hope, perhaps, but a small sliver of light in the darkness that consumed him. In the days that followed, to his surprise, Lily began to appear in his office. At first, they were quick visits. She simply came in, watched him for a few minutes and left. David was always nearby, waiting patiently outside, respecting that strange connection that was beginning to form. Richard tried to ignore the visits, burying himself in his spreadsheets and documents, pretending not to notice the girl's silent presence. But there was something about the way she was there, without demanding anything, without judging, that gradually broke down his defenses. On a particularly difficult afternoon, when he had just received another notice of bounced check, Richard found on his desk a drawing made by Lily, a tangle of colored lines that somehow conveyed a sense of comfort. It was the first time in months that he allowed himself a smile, albeit brief. But life, unrelenting in its irony, was preparing another blow. One rainy morning, David was crossing the street in front of his work when a speeding car hit him head-on. The driver, who would later be found to be drunk, fled the scene without offering help. David was rushed to the hospital, where doctors were fighting to keep him alive. And so, in a matter of seconds, fate placed in Richard's hands a responsibility for which he was not prepared. Lily was alone with nowhere to go. In the cold hospital hallway, Richard watched Lily through the glass of the waiting room. The girl was sitting in a chair, too big for her size, rocking back and forth in a steady rhythm, her eyes fixed on an invisible point on the wall, her hands tightly gripping the strap of her faded pink backpack. The hospital social worker, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Evans, spoke to him in a low voice. "Mr. Richard, we need to define the girl's situation. She has no other relatives. Her mother passed away 2 years ago, and her father is in a deep coma. Protocol requires that she be placed in a temporary facility." The words, "temporary facility," made Richard shudder. He knew the reality of those places, not from personal experience, but from the stories he had heard. Stories of neglect, of coldness, of children treated like numbers on a spreadsheet. "No," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "I can take care of her, temporarily, until David recovers." The words came out of his mouth before he could think about the implications of what he was saying. Mrs. Evans looked at him with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Mr. Richard, taking care of an autistic child is not simple. She needs special care, routine, monitoring." She consulted her notes. "Do you have experience with autistic children?" Richard shook his head negatively. "No, but—" He looked, again, at Lily through the glass. "She knows me, she trusts me, and I promised David that I would take care of her if something happened." It was a lie, of course. He had never made such a promise, but at that moment, as he watched the girl alone and vulnerable, he felt it was the right thing to do. After hours of bureaucracy, signatures, and commitments, Richard finally received temporary custody of Lily. The first night was a nightmare. Lily refused to sleep, wandering around the house like a restless ghost. When Richard tried to persuade her to go to bed, she had a meltdown, screaming, crying, repetitive movements that lasted for hours. He stayed up all night, helpless, not knowing how to help. The days that followed were not much different. Richard tried to maintain a routine, as David had explained was necessary, but every small change triggered a new crisis. The noise of the blender, the strong smell of cleaning products, even the sound of the television at a low volume. Everything could be a trigger. At the company, the situation worsened every day. Suppliers no longer accepted promises of payment, customers cancelled contracts, and the few employees who still remained began to look for other jobs. Richard divided himself between trying to save his business and taking care of Lily, failing miserably at both tasks. One afternoon, after another disastrous meeting with creditors, Richard found Lily sitting on the floor of his office, surrounded by dozens of paper clips perfectly aligned. She had arranged the small metal objects in complex geometric patterns, creating a kind of mandala that occupied a good portion of the floor. For a moment, he was mesmerized by the precision of the design, by the order she was able to create amidst the chaos. Then his phone rang. It was another debt collector, and as he moved to answer, he accidentally kicked some clips, undoing part of the pattern. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Lily began to scream, a high-pitched and piercing sound that seemed capable of breaking glass. Her hands repeatedly hit her own head, while her body contorted in abrupt and uncontrolled movements. Richard tried to calm her down, tried to remember the gestures he had seen David make, but nothing worked. The meltdown lasted almost 2 hours, leaving both exhausted and shaken. That night, lying in his bed unable to sleep, he began to question his decision. "I can't do this," he murmured to the dark ceiling. "I'm not capable of taking care of her. I'm only making things worse." Guilt, his old companion, returned in full force. First Sarah and Billy, now he was failing Lily too. The next morning, with deep dark circles under his eyes and a heavy heart, Richard called Mrs. Evans. "I need to talk about Lily," he said, his voice choked. "I think she would be better off in a specialized facility." The social worker scheduled a meeting for the next day. Richard spent the rest of the day avoiding looking at Lily, feeling like a coward, a failure. He packed a small bag with her clothes, also putting in the drawing notebook and some colored pencils she loved so much. When night came, he went to check if she was sleeping before retiring. The room was empty. Panic took hold of him instantly. All. The windows were closed, the front door locked. Where could she be? He searched the entire house, calling for her with increasing desperation. He checked every room, every closet, every possible corner. Nothing. That's when he noticed the back. Doctor slightly ajar, he was sure he had closed it earlier. The night was especially cold, and a fine drizzle was falling on the city. Richard ran out without even grabbing a coat. His legs automatically carried him towards the bridge, the place where it had all begun. His heart was beating erratically as he ran through the dark and empty streets. From afar, he spotted a small, solitary figure standing in the middle of the bridge. Lily was there, wearing only her thin pajamas, soaked by the rain. As he approached, he saw that she was trembling violently, but her face maintained that distant expression as always. "Lily," he called softly, afraid of scaring her. She didn't move, continuing to stare fixedly at the dark waters of the river below. Richard came closer, slowly, until he was next to her. That's when he noticed she was holding something in her hands. It was the photo frame with the picture of Sarah and Billy, which he kept in his drawer. Tears began to stream down Richard's face, mingling with the rain. Lily turned to him, and for the first time since he had met her, looked directly into his eyes. "They're sad too," she said, her clear voice cutting through the silence of the night. "Like you, like Mommy." At that moment, something inside Richard broke. All the weight he carried, all the guilt, all the pain, it all seemed to overflow at once. He fell to his knees right there, on the wet bridge, sobbing like a child. And then he felt something unexpected. Lily's small hand touching his face, exactly as she had tried to do on the first night. That same night, after returning home with Lily, Richard tore up the paper with the address of the facility that Mrs. Evans had indicated. Sitting on the edge of the girl's bed, watching her restless sleep, he made a silent promise to himself. He would not give up on her, no matter how difficult it was. But fate, in its cruel irony, had other plans. The next morning, upon arriving at his office, he found the building closed and an eviction notice pasted on the door. His heart sank as he read the words printed in cold official letters. The company, his creation of so many years, was officially bankrupt. Dave, his accountant, was waiting for him on the sidewalk with a folder full of documents. "I'm so sorry, Richard," he said, avoiding looking directly into the eyes of his former boss. "We did everything we could, but there's no turning back. The creditors are going to take everything." The next hours passed like a confused blur. Richard signed papers without really reading them, heard explanations he couldn't process, saw years of work dissolve into stamps and signatures. When he finally returned home, he found another notice, this time on his door. The apartment, which was mortgaged, would also be taken by the bank. They had only 3 days to leave the property. Richard sat on the sofa, stunned, while Lily played on the rug with her colored pencils, oblivious to the storm that was forming around him. With the little money he still had, he rented a small room in a boarding house on the outskirts of the city. The place was cramped, with only a single bed, a tiny bathroom, and a small area for cooking. The thin walls let through all kinds of noise from the neighbors, and the smell of mold was constant. The move was traumatic for Lily. The new environment, the different sounds, the strange people, all of this left her in a state of constant agitation. Her meltdowns became more frequent and intense. Many nights, Richard needed to hold her tightly, to prevent her from hurting herself during her episodes of self-harm. To make matters worse, the money ran out faster than he expected. Soon there was no longer enough to pay the basic bills. The refrigerator, which was already small, became emptier every day. Richard began to skip meals to ensure that Lily had enough to eat. One morning, upon waking up, he realized that Lily was too hot. Her forehead burned with fever, and a dry cough shook her small body. Panic took hold of Richard. He had no money for a doctor, let alone for medicine. Desperate, he did something he never imagined he would do. He sat on the sidewalk in front of a drugstore with a small makeshift sign asking for help. The first hours were the most difficult. Each person who passed without looking, each look of contempt or pity, was like a stab at his pride. That's when an elderly lady stopped before him. Without saying anything, she extended some crumpled bills and a card with an address. "It's a community clinic," she explained in a gentle voice. "My son is a doctor there. Tell them Mrs. Eldridge sent you." The clinic was simple but clean and organized. Dr. Paul, Mrs. Eldridge's son, examined Lily with patience and care, respecting her space and her moments of agitation. The diagnosis was not good. Pneumonia setting in, aggravated by the poor conditions in which they lived. "She needs antibiotics and a healthier environment," the doctor explained, prescribing the medication. Seeing the despair on Richard's face, he added, "Don't worry about the payment now, we'll figure something out." But Richard's worry went beyond the medicine. That same afternoon, upon returning to the boarding house, he found an anonymous note under his door. The words, written in irregular script, made his blood run cold. "We know where you are. He can't wake up." At first, Richard didn't understand the meaning of the threat. But then he remembered. David was still in a coma, and the driver who hit him had never been found. Was someone trying to ensure that David didn't wake up to denounce the culprit? His suspicions were confirmed in the worst possible way. When visiting David at the hospital the next day, he discovered that his room had been broken into during the night. Nothing was stolen, but the equipment keeping him alive had been tampered with. Luckily, a nurse noticed in time. The police were called, but without concrete evidence, they could do little. The hospital decided to transfer David to another unit, keeping his new location secret. Richard felt the weight of responsibility increase on his shoulders. Now it wasn't just Lily's health that was at risk, but also David's life. The nights became a torment. Every noise in the boarding house hallway made him jump. He placed a chair against the door and started sleeping sitting up, trying to stay alert. Lily, still sick, alternated between periods of restless sleep and crying spells. One particularly difficult night, when Lily's fever had returned with force, Richard heard footsteps in the hallway. Different from the usual, they were heavy, determined steps that stopped right in front of his door. His heart raced as he saw the doorknob turn slowly. The chair held the door for a few moments, but it wasn't enough. With a strong push, it opened, revealing a shadowy figure in the doorway. Before Richard could react, the man advanced towards him with something shining in his hand. "Where's the paper?" the raspy voice asked. "The hospital documents, where are they?" Richard instinctively placed himself between the intruder and the bed where Lily slept. His heart was beating so hard that it felt like it was going to explode. The intruder advanced violently, pushing Richard against the wall. In the dim light of the room, his face was partially hidden by a cap, but his eyes gleamed with an unsettling determination. The object in his hand was a screwdriver, which he pointed threateningly. "The hospital documents," he repeated, this time louder. "I know you have access to David's records. Where are they kept?" The noise woke Lily, who opened her eyes still groggy from the fever. Upon seeing the scene, she began to scream, not her usual meltdown scream, but a sound of pure terror that chilled Richard's blood. The intruder, startled by the scream, turned quickly towards the girl. It was the moment Richard needed. With a strength he didn't know he had, he pushed the man away from the bed. The two fell to the floor, knocking over the small table that served as a nightstand. The struggle that followed was brutal and desperate. Richard, who had never been in a fight in his life, fought with the energy of despair. His fists hit any part of the aggressor's body he could reach, while trying to avoid the screwdriver that cut through the air, dangerously close to his face. Lily continued screaming, now also thrashing in the bed in the midst of a severe meltdown. Her screams echoed through the boarding house hallway, but no one appeared to help. Whether out of fear or indifference, the other residents remained locked in their rooms. At one point in the fight, the screwdriver struck Richard's arm, opening a deep cut. The sharp pain almost made him give up, but Lily's crying kept him focused. He couldn't let that man hurt her. He couldn't fail to protect her. The intruder, realizing that he wouldn't get what he wanted, began to retreat towards the door. But before leaving, he did something that changed everything. He grabbed Lily by the arm, pulling her violently from the bed. "No!" Richard shouted, getting up with difficulty. "Leave her alone. She has nothing to do with this." "She's the collateral," the man replied, dragging Lily towards the door. "If her father wakes up and denounces me, the girl suffers the consequences." Lily, in total panic, thrashed and screamed louder and louder. Her small body trembled violently, and she began hitting her own head against the wall in an impulse of extreme self-harm. It was at that moment that something inside Richard changed. All the pain, all the fear, all the hesitation disappeared. In their place arose an absolute certainty. He would not lose anyone else he loved. He would not let fate take another person from his life. With a scream that came from the depths of his soul, Richard charged against the aggressor. The impact was so strong that the three of them, Richard, the intruder, and Lily, went to the ground. In the fall, the girl managed to break free and ran to a corner of the room, where she curled up in a fetal position, rocking back and forth. The fight resumed, now more violent than before. The intruder, furious at having lost control of the situation, attacked with the screwdriver without caring where it hit. Richard felt the cutting metal strike his shoulder, his back, his leg, but he didn't stop fighting. The next minutes were a blur of pain and adrenaline. At some point, Richard managed to grab the arm holding the screwdriver and, with a strength he didn't know he possessed, twisted it until he heard the sound of the metal falling to the floor. The intruder, finally realizing that he had lost the advantage, pushed Richard one last time and ran to the door. Before disappearing into the darkness of the hallway, he turned and shouted, "This isn't over. You won't be able to protect her forever." When the sound of the footsteps faded into the distance, Richard dragged himself to where Lily was. His entire body ached, and he could feel the blood running from several cuts. But none of that mattered. He could only think about the girl. "Lily," he called softly, keeping his distance so as not to scare her even more. "It's over. You're safe now." The girl continued to rock, her eyes fixed on a distant point, completely closed off in her own world. The fever had worsened, and her face was red and sweaty. Richard knew they needed help. Both needed urgent medical care. With the last of his strength, he picked Lily up in his arms. She didn't resist. Her small and hot body was limp, as if all her energy had been drained. He stumbled down the stairs of the boarding house, leaving a trail of blood drops along the way. On the street, the cold dawn air hit him like a slap in the face. His legs were shaking, and his vision was beginning to blur. But he kept walking, one step after another, holding Lily close to his chest, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He couldn't say how long he walked, nor how he managed to reach the hospital. His last memories before losing consciousness were of the bright lights of the emergency room and agitated voices around him. The last thing he saw was Lily being taken away by a nurse, and then everything went dark. When he woke up, he was in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and with several tubes connected to his body. The soft light coming through the window indicated that it was early morning. He tried to move, but a sharp pain made him remain still. "Stay still," said a familiar voice. It was Dr. Paul, the doctor from the community clinic. "You lost a lot of blood and needed emergency surgery, but you're going to be okay." "Lily," Richard whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. "Where is she? How is she?" The doctor smiled slightly. "She's fine. The fever has subsided and she's being cared for by our specialized team." He paused before continuing. "And there's one more thing you need to know." Dr. Paul pulled up a chair and sat beside Richard's bed. There was something different about his expression, a mixture of relief and expectation that made Richard feel a pang in his chest. "David woke up," the doctor said simply. "After all these months, he finally came out of the coma." Richard felt tears forming in his eyes. After everything they had been through, finally a light at the end of the tunnel. He's okay? Can he talk?" "Yes, he's recovering surprisingly well. In fact," the doctor paused as if choosing his words, "he's in the room next door. He asked to see you as soon as he heard what happened." Before Richard could respond, the door of the room opened. A nurse was pushing a wheelchair where David was, still visibly weakened, but with his eyes shining with life. Beside him, Lily walked holding her father's hand tightly. "You saved my daughter," David said, his voice choked with emotion. "You risked your own life to protect her." Richard tried to sit up, but the pain prevented him. "I promised I would take care of her," he replied simply, "even if I never made that promise out loud." David made a gesture, and the nurse moved the wheelchair closer to the bed. "When I woke up," he began, "the first thing I did was ask about Lily. The doctors told me everything, how you took responsibility for her, how you gave up everything to keep her safe, how you faced that criminal, the man who tried to kill you," Richard completed. "He wanted to prevent you from denouncing him when you woke up." "Yes," David confirmed. "The police have already arrested him. He was found in a private hospital, treating injuries consistent with the blows you described. He was a local politician, owner of a construction company. He was drunk when he ran me over and tried to cover up the crime at any cost. Lily, who had been quiet until then, let go of her father's hand and approached Richard's bed. Carefully, as if fearing to hurt him, she touched his face exactly as she had done that first night on the bridge. "You're my dad now too," she said, her voice clear and firm, surprising everyone in the room. It was the longest and most direct sentence she had ever spoken. Richard's heart seemed to stop for a moment. Lily's words, so simple and true, hit him with an overwhelming force. All the losses, all the pain, all the suffering of the past years seemed to find meaning in that instant. "The hospital where I'm staying," David continued, "discovered that there was negligence in my transfer after the first attempted break-in. They made a settlement, a considerable compensation." He paused, looking directly into Richard's eyes. "And I want to share that with you." Richard tried to protest, but David interrupted him. "It's not just for what you did for Lily. It's because we're family now. You showed me that family isn't just blood. It's choice, it's love, it's sacrifice." In the weeks that followed, while both recovered in the hospital, a new routine was established. Lily spent her days moving between her father's and Richard's. Rooms, drawing, talking in her unique way, creating invisible bridges between the two men who were now part of her life. The hospital settlement allowed Richard to begin rebuilding his life. He didn't return to the construction business. He decided to invest in something smaller, more personal. With David's help, he opened a small bookstore in the neighborhood, a welcoming space with a special section of books on autism and child development. David, after his recovery, decided not to return to his old job. "I want to spend more time with Lily," he explained, "and help other families who are going through what we went through." He began working with occupational therapy, specializing in the care of autistic children. The bookstore became a meeting point for parents and special children. Lily had her own space there, a quiet corner with colorful cushions where she could draw and read. Her meltdowns still happened, but now there was more understanding, more tools to deal with them, more love to get through them. On a particularly meaningful afternoon, almost a year after the events that changed their lives, Richard found Lily sitting on the floor of the bookstore, surrounded by her drawings. She had created a series of illustrations. In one of them, 3 figures holding hands, her, David, and Richard. "Family," she said simply, pointing to the drawing. Richard knelt beside her, feeling tears begin to form, no longer tears of pain or despair, but of gratitude and love. "Yes, Lily," he replied, his voice soft. "Family." That night, after closing the bookstore, Richard walked with David and Lily to the bridge where it had all begun. The river flowed silently below them, reflecting the lights of the city. Lily, between the two, held their hands tightly. "Sometimes I think about Sarah and Billy," Richard said, looking at the dark waters, "but no longer with guilt. Now I think of them with gratitude. If it weren't for that night of despair on the bridge, if it weren't for all the pain that brought me here, I would never have found you." David squeezed his shoulder in a gesture of silent understanding. Lily, perceiving the emotion in the air, began to hum softly, a melody she had created herself, her particular way of expressing affection. There, on the bridge that once witnessed so much pain, a new family strengthened. Not a family conventional, not a blood family, but a family built on the foundations of love, understanding, and unconditional acceptance. Richard looked at Lily, who was now smiling in a way that only she knew how, a smile that illuminated not only her face, but her entire being. In that moment, he understood that sometimes we need to get completely lost to find our true way back home. And his home now was there, not in a physical place, but in the invisible and unbreakable bonds that united him with David and Lily. A family that was born from pain, grew through love, and strengthened by the choice to stay together no matter what happened. The future still held challenges, of that he was certain. There would be more of Lily's meltdowns to manage, more obstacles to overcome, more difficult moments to get through. But now it was different. Now he was no longer alone. The night fell softly over Chicago, and the first stars began to appear. In the sky, Lily pointed to one of them, particularly bright, and smiled. Family, she repeated, her favorite word, her anchor in the world. Yes, little one, Richard replied, feeling his heart overflowing with love. Family, forever.